Good afternoon. Welcome to our Coaching Tools to Empower Performance webinar. We are joined by Gillian Jones-William and Gorell today, who I'm delighted to introduce. Gillian is Managing Director of Emerge, an organisational and behavioural change consultancy. Gillian has worked as an executive coach and consultant for over 20 years, supporting organisations to transform their business and empower teams through creating a coaching culture. Ro is a Director of Change Optimised, an organisation development consultancy. She specialises in adaptive change coaching and leverages her change management experience to support organisations seeking agility and change capability. Just a quick reminder that if you have any questions for Gillian or Ro throughout this session, please use the online function below and they'll aim to answer as many as they can prior to close today. Okay, that's all from me for now. I'll hand you over to Gillian and Ro to begin the session.
Thanks very much, Julie. So today, some of you listening in may already be coaches. Some of you may be thinking of starting your coaching and need some help where to start. And then again, some of you may be interested in techniques that you can use yourself. So in this webinar today, what we're going to be covering is understanding what we mean by a coaching mindset, being clear on what coaching is and what it isn't. And I'm not sure if you can see the slide. It's suddenly disappeared on my screen. Hopefully it's coming back. Whoops, let's go back. So be clear on what coaching is and isn't, to be able to use a coaching model in any situation. And we're going to talk you through a coaching model that we write about in our book. We're also going to be covering some of the new tools that we've included in this 4th edition, which are tools used to develop women, and also understanding how to use agile group coaching tools to co-create change. So without further ado, what do we actually mean by coaching? And this is a sort of question that people often ask, what is coaching? And it often gets confused with different things, such as teaching. Is it teaching, training, counselling, coaching, mentoring? What is it? So what we're going to do is we're going to give you some thoughts on what we mean by coaching and what actually coaching involves. So what we mean, first of all, is that it's about unlocking a person's potential. And this is a quote from Sir John Whitmore. We also are hoping the slides that you can see, because they keep disappearing on my screen. It's come back again. It could be to do with, I'm actually calling in from Western Australia, so it could be to do with our very flaky internet connection. So the first thing is that it's about unlocking a person's potential, and that's a quote from Sir John Whitmore. The second is that it's the art of facilitating the performance, learning and development of another, and that's by Miles Downey. And the third one is it's not telling people what to do. It's about giving them a chance to examine what they're doing in the light of their intentions. And the way that I probably would summarize all of that is that coaching is a conversation with a purpose. So when we coach somebody, what sort of things do we get involved in? Well, first of all, coaching is a personal development process, and it's about helping the individual identify what they want to achieve, either in their personal or their business objectives. It's also a time-based activity. In other words, it doesn't go on forever, because what you don't want to do is create self-reliance on the coach. You want to create self-reliance on the individual. Thirdly, it's about how you both work together within groups and individuals, developing that relationship. So it's very much about that relationship between the coach and the coachees. It's also based on results, and the results are positive action from the coachee. You actually want them taking action from the coaching and not just using it as an opportunity to talk. Also, it's about the behavioural and attitudinal shifts that the individual makes during the coaching process. And in essence, this is about the coachee's sense of identity, how they transform in the process of the coaching and how they see themselves differently at the end of the coaching process from when they start. And then for coaching that is done in organisations, obviously there needs to be a link back to the business strategy and the performance of the business. because organisations want to see a return on that investment. And also there is that tripartite contracting between both the coachee and the manager, because of course they've all got an interest in the outcome. So I think we're going to be launching a vote from the audience at this stage, Julie. So if you want to pull that up now. So I think that means that the voting is finished, and it looks like you're not yet using coaching and you're keen. Oh, sorry, I stand corrected. I'm getting to grips with this technology. Okay, so I'm hoping that that's the end of the voting. And it looks like there's a sort of a split between the audience, that some are using coaching most days, and the remainder are not yet using coaching and keen to learn. So hopefully we've got something for everybody in this presentation, and hopefully that's just given you a flavour of what we mean by coaching and the coaching mindset and what it is and isn't. And what I'm now going to do is, as promised, to hand you over to Gillian, who's going to talk you through some coaching models that we use and some of the tools that we've now introduced into our 4th edition. So over to you, Gillian.
Thank you very much, Ro, and thank you for inviting us to present here. So I've been coaching people for about 15 years now, teaching coaching, being an executive coach, the whole remit. And there's a few things that I've learned about coaching that we'd like to share with you in the next session. The first part is that coaching is not necessarily a structured activity that happens when you have an hour to spend. And this is what we meant in our objectives about looking at developing a coaching mindset. Those of you who are coaching and who are managing people, and those of you who are looking to coach, you may not be aware of this, but your people are asking you for coaching from the minute they walk in the door to the minute they leave. Now, that might surprise you because, of course, they don't use the words, "could you please coach me," on the whole. But there could be many other ways in which they ask you for coaching. So if you start to think of those in your head, I'll give you some of the suggestions and some of the things that I see. Sometimes what they'll say is, "I'm not sure about. I don't know how to. I'm a bit nervous about. I've had a conversation with, and I don't know which option to go with." On the whole, when our people that we manage ask us these questions, what we tend to do is rush to give them the answer. There's lots of reasons for that. One, it's often faster. Two, sometimes people think, well, I'm their manager, I need to be here to help them. And sometimes we just feel it's a safer bet to do that. But if we really want to develop and grow our people, then the most important thing is that we're constantly challenging them to be able to solve problems. And that's where the coaching model that we're going to talk about comes into play. There are many, many coaching models around. Ro mentioned a quote by Sir John Whitmore earlier, and he was one of the originators of the GROW coaching model, which is quite a renowned coaching model, the goal, reality, options, and will model. So some of you may have been exposed to that. So the model that I'm going to show you that comes from our book is one which is a development on the GROW model, and it's called the Oracle model. Now you can see it in front of you, and this model has certain parts to it. The first one is about the outcome. What outcome does the person want to achieve from the issue that they're bringing with you? But the extension that we wanted to make to the GROW model was to get you to truly think, what is the real issue that the person is bringing? Often in coaching, the stated issue is rarely the real issue. They might start to talk about something, but if you probe deeper below, there are several other layers before we start to actually coach the person on the right issue. Then, of course, it's about what alternatives are there, and those alternatives might be, what have they tried already that they could potentially try again and do differently? And then we want to start getting creative and thinking, what else might you not have thought about? Once a person has generated a whole range of options, or maybe just two options, then there's the process of evaluation in terms of which would work best. And we call this the likelihood of success. So when I say to you, you've told me that there are three potential options, which do you think might be the most successful? And then, of course, there's the move into an action plan where we execute this. Now, what we believe about coaching, when you look at this model here, and that's why the picture depicts this slightly differently, is that coaching isn't a structured process that you go through with one level after each other. And if you do, it can often come across as being quite clunky. And that's where people say, oh, yes, they were coaching me. It didn't feel natural. Because people can enter this model at any part, at any time, and it's up to you to decide where to go. So, for example, they might not necessarily come to you and say, I have a problem, can I talk about it? Which would mean you could start at the beginning and say, okay, what outcome do you want? But they might come to you, say at the bottom, and say, I've got a couple of ideas that I just want to talk to you about. In which case, you might want to think, okay, well, let's go back to the top of the model and say, okay, well, before we talk about the ideas, what's an ideal outcome for you? Or can you tell me a bit about the issue so we can check that these ideas will solve the creative issue? It might even be that they come to you with an action plan. I'm just about to go and call someone, at which point you might be slightly alarmed, but before you do, you want to say, okay, well, before you do, let's tell me a little bit more about the issue, and then let's talk about the outcome. So as you could see, you might hop around this model in many, many different ways. And my belief is that great coaches are very, very fluid. And providing you've touched every point of that model, and some of them you might touch several times because you might just get to the execute part of the model, be talking about what they will do, and then they tell you about another issue which you think, hang on a second, is this a real issue that we should be dealing with? And then you go again. So this model is in our book with a lot more depth to have a look at, but it gives you the basis of having both casual coaching conversations and also more structured conversations. We're going to try and launch another vote now because I'm interested in a comment from you. So, Julie, if we could launch the second vote, I'll work on Ro's experience on how long it takes. So,
Yep, that's it launched, so it needs to be open for 50 seconds before we can see
50
results.
seconds, thank you very much. And this vote is going to be asking you to think about, is it easier and quicker to tell people what to do rather than coach them? So I'm interested in your experiences now. Okay. So if you can just think about it on a day-to-day basis, or if you haven't started coaching yet, think about what you might do if people came to you and were asking some of the questions we discussed. Okay. I can see the answer come through, and I'm presuming, Julie, that's the end of the time. All of the time, most of the time, some of the time. So I'm looking at this, and 40% of people are saying that yes, it is quicker and easier to tell people what to do. Actually, that's now changed. Good. Okay. So I think we must be near closing. So we've got a variety. Some of you think yes, it is. Some of you think some of the time. But it's interesting that we haven't got any people voting for rarely or never on that one, because we work on a premise when we're coaching that 95% of people can solve their own problems given the right climate to do so. And it could be that this helps you to differentiate again the difference between teaching and coaching. If you think about it, if someone has a problem that they need coaching on, it's likely to be something that they've had some experience of in the past or might know something about. If it wasn't and they knew nothing about it, you'd have to teach them about it. So within coaching, I have to accept that you have been dealing with this issue for 100% longer than me because you've only just told me about it. And therefore, if I start throwing solutions and suggestions at you, they're likely to be things that you've already thought about. And I bet you can think of times when you've been at work and you've perhaps been struggling with an issue or a problem that you want to resolve, and you felt absolutely blocked and thought, I just don't know the answer. But maybe you've gone to chat with a friend over a coffee or something like that, or perhaps you've gone for a walk, in which case you started to self-coach, and you've given your brain some space to think about it. Suddenly, you start to come up with thoughts and suggestions. That's what coaching is really about. It's about giving people the space to be able to get their thoughts in order. And often I think about it and describe coaching as being a cupboard cleaner. Can you all picture the type of cupboard that I'm sure we've all had in our houses at some point that is so full that if you open it, the kind of things fall out? If you were going to go and clean that cupboard out, there's really only one way to do it, isn't it? You've got to take everything out before you put something back in it. If you try and shove things into it while it's still full, it's just going to explode. That's what happens with coaching. In my mind, I might have a whole range of things going on. I've got concerns, I've got memories, I've got thoughts, I've got things that I've tried, I've got fears, I've got blockers. It's all going on in my brain. The coach's job is almost to help you to empty that brain of a cupboard onto the table in front of you and to tidy it up so that you can very, very clearly see what is the problem. Then you can very, very clearly see what potential solutions you've got or potential solutions that you've done before. And you can also see what a good outcome would look like. Sometimes that's all people need to do to be able to solve their problems. They need to be able to identify what success would look like. Once it's all on the table in front of them, often they find it's very, very easy to be able to select what to do. So if you can see your role as a coach in doing that, that's when we become really, really successful. One of the key things that you're going to need to do to be great at doing that is to be a great listener. And you've probably all been told, you've probably all learned or been on training courses where they've talked about listening. But this is about taking listening to another level. Because when you're coaching, you're not only listening for what is being said, but you're listening for what is not being said. And that means you're watching very, very closely their non-verbal responses, their physiology, everything about them. So there are a few things we really, really need to be clear on. And again, in our book, we talk in much more depth about the importance of listening within coaching. So here are a few highlights. The important thing is to not leap to judgments. Most people don't use all of their listening capacity effectively because the minute somebody else starts to speak, their brain starts to jump too, trying to form ideas, suggestions and questions. So being able to listen without judgment and respect that their view is different. Often what happens when someone starts speaking, we think, yeah, I've heard this before, so our brain shuts down a little bit. And that means being what we call totally present. So we're there in real time. It's a real deep listening where we are showing interest, we're listening actively, we're really focusing on the other person, which builds a level of rapport and means that the person feels safe to talk to you about the issues that are concerning them. Then, of course, it's about being able to relate to what they're saying, not necessarily agree with it, but show some empathy, which makes them feel it's all right to carry on talking. And the most important skill that we have discovered within coaching is about reflecting. And reflecting is where we give back to another person what we have heard from them in as near as their own words as we can, without them feeling like we're just repeating it back and wanting to slap us and say, I just said that. So it's giving them a good, honest and sharp reflection to say, so what I heard was, you are struggling with this. It's not about adding our own spin to it. It's very much about talking out loud what they've heard. And there's been a lot of research to show that when we hear what's going on in our heads spoken through somebody else's words, it makes a lot more sense to us. It can be quite fascinating sometimes when you reflect to another person, and as you reflect and you say to them, this is what I heard from you, sometimes they go, yeah, no, I don't think that is what's happening, even though you've reflected it accurately. So it very much helps them to sort out their thinking, where they are and what's going on with them. It's one of the most important skills, I think, that has ever come into any of our training programs, and certainly in life it's a great helpful one as well. So if you're sitting there thinking, I don't think I reflect very much, perhaps that's something for you to spend some more time on. Reflecting does several things. One, it shows the other person that you're listening. Two, it encourages them to go on. Sometimes when we talk about coaching, people think it's about having all these clever questions that we can very quickly come in with. And questions are important, and we'll talk about those in a second. And there are plenty in our book which, if you need questions, are there. However, when you're reflecting back, often you don't need clever questions, because if a person says to you, I've taken on this big project and now I'm feeling quite stressed, rather than thinking of a clever question to ask about what sort of stress it is, you can almost just reflect back and then say, and you said you were feeling stressed, but I'm going to come on to that in a second. One of the other things you really need to think about when you're coaching somebody is the type of questions that you use. And the first one here we're going to look at is, what's your motivation for asking a question? If you're asking a question because you are interested in the subject, that might make for a great conversation, but it won't necessarily be very, very useful to the other person to help them get further along in solving their problems. So let me give you an example of this. If I was being coached and I said to the person coaching me, I've got such a problem with my team. And they said, how many people are in your team? That would be an interested question. I know how many people are in my team, so it's not necessarily useful to me. If I said, I've got a very, very difficult project, and they say, okay, and who's that project with? And I say, well, this is with a chartered bank. Again, that's because their brain has jumped to interested. Some people, my husband's one of those, finds it very, very difficult to ask questions or be in a conversation unless he knows every bit of detail around the subject. So often we'll ask random questions like this, but he is still in training and coaching. So therefore, what you have to think about is, what are the useful questions that I can ask? A useful question might be, so how long has the problem been going on? Okay, it might be, how do you think other people perceive the problem? Those would be useful questions that you could ask, and not necessarily questions which would just stop the person in their thought process so that they had to answer the more random questions. Over the years, I've developed a great desire to leave behind some of the better formed questions, and Ro and I have taken some time to look at the impact of vague questions in coaching. Now, when you look at vague questions, what we mean are questions which will potentially hit the unconscious mind rather than the conscious mind. And these might be questions such as reflective, unfinished, or vague. And you can see some examples here. The reason for this is the person doesn't feel quite so interrogated, and because the questions aren't so well formed. I hope that gives you an insight into some of the information around base coaching models. I'm just going to do a quick tour, very, very fast tour, of some of the tools that we've got in our book. Now, as we mentioned earlier, it's called 50 Top Tools for Coaching, and that is exactly what it is. In fact, that's not true. It's not 50. There are more in there, but there are some from other coaches as well. So the tools that Ro and I want to alert you to are just some new ones that we've put in this year. One of them is around the area of developing women, and I'll very quickly talk to you about those. And the other is about coaching through change, and Ro will talk to you about some fascinating work that she's been doing there. So a lot of the work that we do on women's development now is very, very important as organisations are clearly looking at how do they promote women, how do they help them to develop. A lot of the tools will start to be around career as well and how they're visualising their future. So within the book you'll find some really, really good career tools. One of the pieces of background behind this is that we found that when you can actually visualize and you have a clear visualization of what your career is going to be, it can happen quite naturally. The problem with a lot of people is they don't know what they really want in their career, and because their goals aren't firmly enough set, they don't actually focus and seek the opportunities that are around them. To be successful, we've looked at lots of tools around emotional intelligence, and I'm sure many of you have looked at the subject and studied the subject. So in looking at this subject, as you can see, the emotional intelligence model there, how self-aware are you of the things that you do that other people might notice? And that's very, very important when coaching others. More importantly, how good are you at reading the signs in other people and picking those up, which leads to relationship management. But the tools that we're going to focus on in the next couple of minutes are just around the self-management. And this is an area which I find that women need to work a lot on, because often there is a level of confidence that needs to be improved. Self-management and self-regulation is about our ability to be able to choose the right behaviour at the right time. And that's quite a big statement for people to accept sometimes, because often people want to say, well, it's not always possible because other people make me angry, or other people make me irritated or make me upset. But true emotional intelligence is about your ability to accept that stimulus happens, and when stimulus happens you will feel something and you will want to respond, But between stimulus and response, you have the freedom to choose. And at any given time, we can choose our behaviour. So within the book, we've put some tools in there to help you to look at, well, how do I choose the right behaviour? Because there are times when, I know we all don't. Because, as I said, we have the choice to be angry or whether we can display our anger in the right way. One of the other things which affects how women work is often what we call the voices inside their head. I don't know whether you think you have any voices inside your head. Nearly everybody I work with do. If you think that you don't, it could be that voice in your head which has just said, no, I don't have one. But they generally are there. So we often have to work with women to look at this. And this year we've included a tool which helps you to really think about how do those voices in your head, that inner critic, how do they help you or how do they hinder you? And what is it that you're saying to yourself? Now, I don't think this is just a women thing, but often what they're saying to ourselves is something which is called imposter syndrome. And over the years, I have coached so many women in senior positions, very, very big jobs, men as well, who after a while have sat and said to me, I don't really think that I deserve to be here, or I'm just waiting for them to work out that I don't really know what I'm doing. So they've put a name on that and they've called it imposter syndrome, that feeling that even though there is validation and evidence that you deserve to be where you are, there is a feeling by you that you don't deserve to be there. And that often comes down to the beliefs that we hold. And when we can change our limiting beliefs and how we feel about life, ourselves, other people, then things really do begin to change and people become very, very successful. So one of the exercises in the books is about changing belief and breaking that belief cycle. And it's actually quite a simple exercise, and it's one that you could do yourself. We don't have time to do it now, but it's a series of questions. So I often ask people what the limiting belief is that they hold and get them to think about, where did it come from? What does it limit you? What caused you to decide that it was true? Did you actually have evidence about it, or is it just your inner voice which is doing this? Does it serve you or help you? And most people will say no. So perhaps their limiting belief is, I'm useless at presentations. And we've both coached a lot of people who lose sleep before presentations. Excuse me. Then what we do is we ask them to think about what would happen if you continued to believe this, and then to change the belief. So if there are any of you sitting out there thinking, one of my beliefs is that I'm useless at presentations, and just think about that dialogue and how it does or doesn't help you, and how it improves your confidence and doesn't improve your confidence. What would you rather believe? What would happen if you believed, I am actually a good presenter, I'm perfectly capable of doing this? And then we might talk to them about how things would improve. How might things get worse? And of course the answer to that has to be, well, they wouldn't get worse, they could only get better. And the million-dollar question, what might stop you from adopting this new belief? And the answer to that always has to be me. So beliefs are very much coming from you, and that's what this systemic model helps us to have a look at. The way that you process your thinking, i.e. whatever goes on in your brain, creates your state, which is how you feel or your mood, and that creates your behavior. So when we're coaching, we're very much encouraging people, not necessarily to look at the behavior that they're displaying and change it, but if you can get them to think about what is the thinking that drove this behavior, that's when sustainable changes happen. And encouraging them constantly to do what we call the 3 C's. Catch it. Catch this internal dialogue, the things which are not happening, the things which are happening in the wrong way. Check it is this helpful to me? Does this work? And change it. And you'll see all of those tools and lots more explanation in the book. So that was a bit of an introduction to some of the work we've been doing and some of the tools we've been creating on how to help women. And I'm now going to hand you over to Ro, who's going to take you through some tools for change now.
Thanks, Gillian. Hopefully I've gone off mute there. So the first tool that I want to introduce you to is actually a tool that was developed by my mentor in change management, and it's from the Lean Change framework developed by Jason Little. And in the book we actually include one of his tools, the Strategic Change Canvas, so you can have a look in more detail about that. And the reason I've included it here, because it's not technically part of our 50 top tools, so the reason I've included it here is because this, since 2015, when I first came across it, was like the light bulb moment for me in terms of how I coach. And you heard Gillian talk about the Oracle model earlier in terms of you don't necessarily follow it step by step. You might enter it at different points. And this lean change cycle is a very simple model or framework that enables that sort of coaching mastery to take place. That in every conversation you have, really what you're focusing on is insights. You're then trying to create options or co-create options, and then you're looking at running experiments. So the individual takes those away, and they're in effect creating experiments that they then go away and introduce, and they come back into the coaching conversation the next time, where you then review what they've done, they gain insights, and so forth and so on. So that very simple cycle is really what's going on in the coaching conversation. And the two key principles there, that you can't control how people respond to change, and people are happier if they have a hand in designing the change. They also form the way that I operate in my coaching practice, that at the end of the day, that is that choice element that Gillian's already mentioned. That if you recognize that you're constantly iterating and learning and gaining insights, and making sure that you actually co-create that process with your client, then hopefully by the end of the process, that transformation that we talked about, that change in identity, will have been facilitated by the conversations that you've had, and obviously the actions that the coachee has taken. So that lean change model that I learned about in 2015 has been one of the key influences on how I coach both groups and how I coach individuals around creating that change capability. And that's change capability either in an organizational setting or individual change. So it's called lean change because it's lean in the dictionary definition sense of the word, that it's simple and then that it's adding value. And that really is what we want to achieve in the coaching tools that we use. So with that in mind, I want to share a tool that sort of came out of a coaching conversation back in 2016. And it really is an amalgam of all of the things that I've been studying and learning in the past 15 years. Spookily, Gillian and I have been coaching for about the same length of time, just coincidentally. And so this tool that we've included in the book is really a way of actually creating that conversation around, well, what is coaching? How do you make sense of it for the individual or the individual joining the group? And what is it going to be like? How are you going to work together in that coaching space? So I've called it, oops, if I can get it to actually load. I'm now challenged by technology. To apologise for that. Okay, cool. So I called it a manifesto because really this is about understanding what your purpose is, what your sort of goals of coaching are about. And I've created it as a sort of a 4 diagonal drawing, purely and simply because that's how my brain saw it. And it came out of a conversation with this individual, as I said, where they were asking questions. Well, what is coaching about? What does it mean? How will we be in the space? And so what I discussed with them was that really the coaching space to begin with is one where you're creating that opportunity for listening. So whilst, as Gillian said, we want to ask questions, and if you're starting your coaching journey, you will be probably focusing on questions quite a lot, and questions are great. Listening, though, is what delivers the question, and it's what delivers the powerful questions in the space that you create in the coaching. The second thing, in no particular order, is that psychological safety in terms of creating a safe space. So yes, you want to challenge people to move out of their comfort zones, and you also want to create that safe space that they feel able to do that, they feel supported. So it's really important in terms of creating that safe space for you and your coaching clients and members of your team as well if you're coaching in an organisation setting. And then the third thing really is this emergent knowledge that comes out of that space and the safety that you've created. Because in generating options, you want people to actually be able to come up with things that maybe they haven't thought of before, or look at using things that's already familiar to them in a different way. And so that curiosity, that willingness to actually just say, well, what if we thought about this in a different way? What if we reframe something? What might that mean? That curiosity is one of the key tools that you can actually use in the coaching conversation, because you want to get to that emergent wisdom coming out of that. And then finally, Gillian's already mentioned this one, and this is a really key one. Listening is part of it. It's also being mentally present as well, in terms of not bringing your stuff into the coaching space before you actually start the coaching conversation. So there's an element of how do you actually prepare for the coaching conversation? Are you in a rush, for example? You know, have you got time to actually give to this person? So being present over just turning up for sessions. Of course, you want people to actually turn up to sessions because that's their commitment. You also want them to be mentally present as well. So as I say, that coaching manifesto it's a description of the as-is. So it's not an aspirational manifesto. It's something that describes what's happening in that coaching space. And that's my take on the conversation I had with the individual. So it's an example. It's not the answer. It's merely an example of what you might co-create. And it's just a way of exploring that. And the idea is that you actually have that conversation with the individual or the group that you're coaching. And you can do that after a few sessions. You can do it up front and say, well, based on the conversation we just had during the intake session, this is what I think we can agree together in terms of how we're going to work, what the purpose is around how we're going to work in the space. So it's very much a sort of conversational starter that you then sort of find a way of noting down so that you've got something to refer yourself back to, and also make sure that you're staying on piece. So that curiosity, that presence, that space, and that psychological safety are the things that came out of the conversation that I had with my coaching client. So the idea is that it's renovated and that you keep it fresh. So that's the first tool that I wanted to share with you and give you a sort of a very creative way of having a coaching conversation rather than a sort of a linear model, which some of you may be more familiar with. So the next tool that I would like to share is around, it's developing perspectives, and it's also around helping organizations develop agility and that curiosity that we've just talked about. And it's based on Kurt Lewin's force field analysis combined with perceptual positions. And for those of you not familiar with the perceptual positions, basically means being able to put yourself into somebody else's shoes. And then just to emphasize a point that Gillian's already made this, but everything we hear is not an opinion, it's not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, it's not the truth. It's merely a lens that we look at the world through, and there are many different lenses. So the particular tool is very simple. as you'll see, a lot of the tools in the book are very simple. And by the way, what we include in the book, that you can use and adapt it in whatever way makes sense to you. So we're not saying that this is the way you have to use it. We're saying this is the way we have used it, and you might want to consider other ways of using it as well. So perspective mapping, simple tool, little template here. For each stakeholder, you ask your client to identify for that particular stakeholder, to get into their shoes. What's it like for them? What might be helping the change for them? What might be hindering the change? And I've used the generic term, the change. Obviously, you can use the actual situation that you're working on. So it might be helping me, let's use one that Gillian talked about, helping me become more confident in making presentations. What's hindering me becoming more confident in making presentations? How might somebody else see it? So how might my manager see what could be helping me? How might my manager see what could be hindering me? So you see how it works? It's about getting those different perspectives and actually putting them onto a piece of paper. And this works really well for individual coaching as well as group coaching. This works really well if you can actually put this up on a big piece of flip chart paper and have it on the wall, and maybe use the positions in the room as well for the different perspectives. So for example, you might have one perspective of the manager, say, on one wall, you might have the individual's perspective on another wall, and you might have a member of the audience perspective on another wall, and anybody else that the individual brings into the room to share their perspective, metaphorically speaking. So you can see how you can use perceptual positions both from who the stakeholder is and also using the place in the room where that particular stakeholder is being placed. And then if you want to take it even further, you can also then use this with groups, and you can actually get them to map out the different stakeholders within the particular change that they're working on. Now, of course, you do have to do this with care because you need to contract around, obviously, confidentiality and making sure that everybody feels psychologically safe to share this. And you could also even get the individuals in the room together. So, for example, if you wanted to do it as a group, then you could split the group into 3 different roles and get them to give the perspective of each of those roles individually as a group, different groups, and then get them to come together at the end to share their perspectives. And you could also run this as a huge workshop and get all of the different roles together and get them to actually note down their perspectives and get people to walk around the room to actually see all the different perspectives and then start to theme. And obviously then what you will notice is where there are huge differences in perspectives, you'll see themes emerging where there's similarity, and then you can start to have a conversation around what those differences and similarities are about. And as Gillian mentioned earlier, really get to what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve here, rather than leaping into solutions without really understanding what it is you're trying to solve. So, as I've already said, this tool, you can make it as big as Ben-Hur, or you can make it as simple and use it at an individual level in a coaching session. This tool can be adapted and used in many different ways. Clearly, you need to take care in terms of how you use it to make sure that you've created that psychological safe zone, as I've talked about already, that you set it up for creativity in a space for thinking rather than judging, and also that you contract around that safe to fail experimental approach. So when you're setting up the sessions, making sure that you're asking people to embrace the beginner's mind and making sure that people feel safe in that space. So there you have, in effect, 3 tools around organizational change and individual change, and how you actually create the conversations for change and how you actually help create that space for thinking and deep presence. There are no right or wrong tools. There are just the tools that actually fit the context. Remember, all tools are contextual, and the tools that help your client essentially are the right tools. So we've shared some of the tools today in our 50 top tools for coaching. We've given you our approach to how we use coaching in our coaching practices. And we hope you've given some insights about what you might be able to do in your coaching experience, and also giving you a desire to practice your coaching more if you're already doing it, and to get started on your coaching journey. So thanks again, and I think it's now over to you to ask questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for the very informative presentation. We've received a few questions, so we'll try and get through them before the end. The first one came through, I believe, Gillian, when you were speaking. They've asked if you're able to explore further the point that people don't know what they want out of their career.
Yes. Thank you very much, Julia. Obviously, it's a very, very big question. But what I often find is that people haven't spent sufficient time thinking about where do I want to be in 10 years' time. Sometimes they've drifted along and it's kind of a life by accident rather than design. And so getting people to really focus on what would my life be like in 10 years can sometimes help them to think about, so what does that mean about my career moves within that period of time? If you're thinking, I could do this and I could do that, or I could do the other, the conversations that you have tend to be very, very diluted. But when you have a firm vision and you know exactly what you want, you'll be surprised at who in your network can help you, and how much you can then apply yourself to achieving those outcomes.
That's great, thanks. Another question I have here is, what about when you're too busy to coach? Often when the pressure's on, I just revert to telling them what to do.
Yes. Ro, would you like to take that one?
Well, I can talk about it from my own experience of managing a team, but for many years, before I found out about coaching, I probably would adopt the approach where it's like, oh, for goodness sake, yes, let's just crack on, do this, and be very directive in the way that I worked. And then when I explored coaching, I started to practice it at work, and I was absolutely amazed by the difference it made, both to how I felt, because I felt less stressed, and also the difference it made to the team, that they suddenly were able to step up, do more, take greater responsibility, and it was just absolutely amazing. And that was probably one of the biggest light bulb moments in my whole career. And so very much from a personal experience there. But I would always say that if you think you haven't got enough time to coach people, then you're probably thinking about the short term rather than the long term. So if you really want to think about the long term, then coach rather than direct.
Thank you, Ro. May I add something there, Julie, because I think that Ro's absolutely right about in the short term. I think there are occasions where maybe we're in a emergency situation, or it really is so busy that we kind of do have to. And I think the thing is to make sure that you debrief with the person afterwards and coach them retrospectively and say, okay, now during that, I told you to do this. Now let's think about, what do you think made me tell you to do it that way? What would you do if you're in that situation again? So you can retrospectively coach, but I think the one thing that you have to be really careful about is not having this sort of slightly bipolar way of managing. Some days I'm in coaching mode, and today we're under pressure, so I'm in telling mode, and you're not quite sure which one you're going to get. I think it's kind of almost better to be one or the other.
That's great. Thank you both. The next question I have is, how will you know if you moved from coaching someone into mentoring or teaching them?
Okay. Ro, I can pick that one up if you like.
Go for it.
I think this is such a grey area, and we spend a lot of time putting in mentoring programs and talking about this to people. So I think that we can tell you some of the clear differences between coaching and mentoring so that you can differentiate. The skills themselves are quite similar. In coaching, the coach will always start with an objective for what will be achieved at the end of coaching, and it is the responsibility of the coach to work with that person to ensure it's achieved. In mentoring, the responsibility is all down to the individual, and mentoring should be led by the individual, so the mentor doesn't have the responsibility of making sure there is an action plan, they're achieving their action plan, or working with them in any way. And the other big difference, obviously, is that a mentor is always somebody who's not their line manager. Apart from that, the skills are very, very similar. So it's a bigger subject, that, Julie, but that's a quick answer.
Thanks, Gillian. I think we have time for just one more question. What do you do if you're coaching someone and they come up with a solution which you know won't work?
So this is always an interesting one. So the first thing to ask is it going to cause them harm if they go ahead and do what they're thinking of doing? So that's the first thing you always think about. If it's not going to cause harm, then at the end of the day, what might they learn from having that experience and getting maybe not the results they think they're going to get, and then learning from that? So everything is a learning opportunity, and provided they're not going to do harm to themselves or others, then you are disempowering the person if you stop them from doing something, even if you think it might not work, because of course, as we said before, it's context dependent. So what didn't work in one context might work in another. And because you're not omnipotent, you don't actually know what's going to happen. So you could also be surprised as the coach. So I think it's that suspend judgment and allow the individual to have that learning experience.
Thanks, Ro. I think we have time to kind of squeeze one last question in, because it's quite a nice one to end on, and it is, what tips do you have for someone who's just starting their coaching journey?
Okay. I'll give a couple, Rowan, if you want to jump in on the end of that. I think the first tip is to relax into listening, because on the whole, most people don't get listened to enough in the workplace. If you're so focused on actually using a coaching model, then often you will lose some of what's going on in that session. So I would say start by just practicing really, really great listening and reflective listening, as we talked about earlier, and see what happens then, and then gradually bring in other bits and other models to help you. And I think you'll find that even just by listening to people, you'll find they'll say, oh, thank you very much, that's really helped, and you'll think, I didn't do anything, but it does help. Do you want to add one, Ro?
Do you know, so Gillian's based in the UK and I'm based in Western Australia, and we haven't seen each other since 2012, so although we write together, we do it all remotely. And it just shows how in sync we are, because that's exactly what I was going to say. Listening, and also noticing when your internal dialogue kicks in and what that might be about for you, and then checking yourself. So if you're listening, times a million.
Well, thanks again, both. You've certainly given us some great points to take away and think about today. For our viewers at home, we've included a link to download a copy of today's slides in the attachments tab, as well as some other links you might find useful, including a link to buy the 50 Top Tools for Coaching book. I'd just like to ask one final favour of our audience to please remember to give us a rating and some feedback on today's session, so we can keep delivering what you'd like to hear. And then finally, just thanks again to Gillian and Ro. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights and advice. And also thanks to everyone at home for joining us. Have a great day. Goodbye.
Thanks, Julie.
Thank you, Julie.